We're a red light on the streaming right from second one. I'm shocked. Okay, let's get going. So, thank you, DSP and Wi-Fi. Yeah. Okay. What's an ancestor? We're going to talk a lot in this course about ancestry, and so I want to lead with a rather simple question. What is an ancestor? Yeah.
The person you're descended from.
Okay, I like that.
So, like a great grandparent or something. You're the ancestor.
Okay, you don't necessarily have to write this yet, but that's not a bad definition. A living thing from which you descend. That you boom right there. Thank you. So, if they are your ancestor, you're their descendant. That's true. I don't know if that's a super helpful answer, though it's correct. It's definitely correct. Help me out here. Who is my ancestor and who isn't? And I think it can be helpful to look at a family tree. So I grabbed one and I grabbed the royal family, because why not? And so let's talk about, like, Prince Louis. Who are Prince's ancestors?
Mama Louis.
Sorry?
Mama Louis.
I don't see a Mama Louis, sorry. I also don't see a Papa Louis. Yep.
Charles, King George.
Okay, so Charles, Philip, George. Is that all?
And everyone else in there.
Is Prince Andrew Prince Louis's descendant? Or ancestor, rather? Like, he's an old dude in his family. Does that count? Is that the definition? Old dudes in your family?
Kind of.
Well, this is an important question. Is Andrew an ancestor? Yes, I'm asking the question because it's possible, so I want to know yes or no.
No.
Okay, I agree, actually. Andrew is not. What about Diana? Is she an ancestor?
No.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, she is. Yeah. So we're going to take Andrew out, which we should do for lots of reasons. But Diana is in. She is an ancestor. What about Catherine? Yeah, that's his mom, right? So Kate, she's an ancestor. What about William? What about Camilla, stepmom? No. Okay. What about Elizabeth? Queenie, Liz?
Yeah.
Yeah, Liz is, absolutely. What about Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother? Yeah. What about Margaret?
No.
No. So what's the path here then?
Like stick to the left side as far as possible almost.
Okay, what if I mirrored this? There's no reason it has to be that shape. Yeah.
Because they didn't have any kids.
Well, Margaret. Okay, but like Harry and Meghan have kids.
Oh, yeah.
Right? But they're not ancestors. Like, are they ancestors? So, the basic idea is this. They're the people that, Back to the Future? Everyone seen Back to the Future? Most people seen Back to the Future. Good movie, classic movie. Goes back in time to the 50s, runs into his mother, almost prevents his mother and father from falling in love, and then he starts to, fade out, because if your parents never got together, there can't be a you, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So, if William and Catherine had never gotten together, could we have a Prince Louis? No, of course not. But if Harry and Meghan had never gotten married, does that affect Louis?
No.
So one way to think about an ancestor is it's everybody in the past who, if you took them out of the equation, Back to the Future rules say you don't. Does that make sense? That's one way to think of it. If you are directly descended from them, if they had to have a kid who 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 had you, if you take somebody out of that link, boom, there's no you. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to give you two definitions for ancestor. One of them is a bit technical, and the other one is a bit more common sense like that. So forgive the kind of common sense. They are people directly in your family lineage. In other words, just parents and grandparents. And just biological. If you took them out, you couldn't exist.
Well, technically, I'm already born.
You know my feelings on the word technically right before saying something stupid, right?
I just said
All right, moving on.
before I technically.
Well, there's that too. I'll leave your family relations to you. Another definition, a more technical definition, is this. Individuals whose DNA is passed on to you. Because your DNA is the result of your parents getting it from their parents, who from their parents, who got it 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 from their parents. So everyone who's directly in your, and that is only parents. You may have DNA common with an aunt and uncle, but you didn't get your DNA from your aunt or uncle. Your DNA can only come from your parents. And your parents couldn't get their DNA from an aunt or an uncle, only from their parents. And so on and so forth. Now, obviously, there are situations where you could have an aunt or an uncle who is also a biological parent. I'm not going to get into these things. We don't have no soap opera time here. But yes, like we're talking, we are speaking. Oh, let's not get specific. When I taught in Smithville, this is where I'd make a Dunville comment. Man, that room would go wild for a Dunville joke. This is where I'd totally say something like, "Now, obviously, this gets a bit more complicated if you're teaching biology in Dunville." But anyway, that was like the rivalry.
Alabama of Tiger region.
It's actually a lovely place. But man, Smithville had such a rivalry with Dunville. They'd just he'd eat it up. Have the class in the palm of your hand if you make fun of Dunville. All right. So, are we kind of comfortable with that? Yes. And keep in mind that it actually spreads out as you go up. Because we showed Elizabeth's mom and dad here, but we didn't show Philip's mom and dad. And we didn't show Diana's mom and dad, and Diana's mom's mom, and Diana's mom's dad, and Diana's dad's mom, and Diana's dad's dad. So it gets wider as you move up. Does that make sense? You have more grandparents than you have parents. You have more great-grandparents, even if they aren't still living, than you have grandparents, and so on and so forth. It spreads as you go up. Cool? Does anyone have someone in their family who does their ancestry?
My father did.
My aunt is obsessed. My aunt got into this over COVID. She had a job that she couldn't go back to, so she was stuck at home all day. So she got super, and now every week you get these crazy emails from her where she's like, "You know that our great 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 uncle is a saint?" And I'm like, "I did not know that, Kathy, but now I do." And then the next day you go "Did you know that we are directly descended from?" And I'm like, "I did not know that, Kathy. Thank you for sharing." Anyway. By virtue of the fact that your ancestral tree gets wider as you go back, if you go back far enough, you're probably descended from just about every kind of person imaginable.
Well, isn't how much of the population is related to Genghis Khan?
I mean,
a lot of it.
Long story short, 100% of it, depending on how you relate to it. But the descendants of, I don't know, but probably a fair amount because he just lived so long ago, right? Genghis Khan lived, I don't even know, when? Yeah, I don't know either. But anyway, a long time ago.
Probably lower. Genghis Khan.
Now I'm trying to remember. I should know that. I did take history, but obviously didn't pay enough attention. All right, so.
It doesn't even give you a year when he's born. It just says Mongolia, but died in 1227.
1227. See, that's more recent than I would have guessed. I would have guessed 600 or 700 AD. So, there we go. Or CE, I guess we say now. Okay. Now, with the idea of ancestry is going to come the driving factor in biology. And if you take grade 12 bio, we do a whole unit about that. Oh, sorry. No, it's this course we do a whole unit about. If we get to it, it's the last unit. And sometimes I go a little slow. We're going to talk about evolution, what it means that we've evolved over time. But long story short, hey.
0.5% of the male population.
Well, there you go. So that could be you. So if you go back in time far enough, you have ancestors that were not human. We know, all the sciences, if you go back in time far enough, there were things reproducing and changing over time that eventually, over generations and generations, changed and changed and changed and became more human-like and more human-like and more human-like. And at some point, we could say, at this artificial barrier, that was human. And we are all descendants of the first human, whatever that may look like. And realistically, that's probably evolution that happened parallel. There were probably a few first humans. Maybe not, though. But over time, generation to generation, we see slight difference. Now, you can already see that in small ways. I had a friend who lived in Japan, and he always laughed because the Japanese population, as the diet changed in the post-war years, and especially in like the 80s when American culture became a major export, the Japanese population got dramatically taller over the course of about 40 years. This is a famous example of this, just in a microcosm, that with changing dietary habits and changing sort of lifestyle and the genetics and all the combination of the above. And so he used to laugh that when he first moved to Japan, all the public buildings had almost comically low doors. Pretty much everyone had to stoop to get through because over the course of a pretty short period of time, the whole population just got taller. But that happened earlier on to Western side. If you ever visit Fort George in Niagara Falls and see uniforms worn by people in the War of 1812, everybody is comically short. Sorry? Exactly. Because over time we see small changes. And that's a pretty small change, right? Just getting a little bit taller on average. But that happened just over the course of 100 years. But again, not for its time, yeah.
Are they like my height?
I don't know.
I'm 4'10".
Yeah, so probably a little taller than you. But when you think of a modern soldier, you think of somebody who's like 6'4" and like 250 and like built, right? Like you picture like army guys walk in the room. You're picturing really big people. You're not picturing somebody shorter than me, right? Like you're not. Like that's not what you expect. Though, yes, still probably taller than you. So it could be. I don't think so, though. I think more likely it's just your genetics, which is okay. So there are small changes in organisms from generation to generation. But over millions and even billions of years, these changes compound and become major differences. So some of you are evolved from monkeys or we're evolved from apes, but that's not really true. What is true is that there was an organism in the past that is an ancestor to both of us. There's an organism that no longer exists, no longer around. But as it gave birth, some of them that maybe lived on the hot plains where the sun would beat down, they evolved where the ones that stood more upright did better because instead of the sun beating down on their back and them getting really hot, that's one of the advantages of bipedal things, is that a hot midday sun hits less of your body and you have less heat to absorb, which means you don't need to have as much hair to sort of manage temperature. And so you get these changes. And so, over time, Each new generation was a little bit different, but in different places, in different environments, different traits took hold. And slowly but surely, over millions and millions and millions of years, you get new species that both descend from the same parents, but now are different from one another. That's what the theory of evolution tells us, and that word theory shouldn't be taken to mean, oh, it's just kind of a guess at what happened. We have a when we say theory in science, we just mean the thing we are working on and figuring out. But we have a very, very, very rich evidence to think this, and we'll talk about what that is. So, small changes in organisms from generation to generation to generation compound over time to become really big changes. This may not sound like much, but just think like the difference between making $14 an hour versus $15 an hour at your job. It's a small difference, but now if you made that and said, okay, over the course of my life, if I'm making $1 more than the guy next to me, what's the difference? Turns into a lot of money. $40 every week, which amounts to about $2,000 every year. If you're working for 30 years, that's a $60,000 difference right there. I'll take $60,000, I guess. Right? And that's only over one lifetime of working. So now imagine small changes over the billion-year lifespan of the planet Earth. Small changes can turn into big changes with enough time. And it is really hard for us to wrap our head around that time scale. Remember, humans writing things down have only been around for a fraction, tiny sliver of the amount of time Earth has been around. Earth is old, and things have been around changing for a long time. Okay, so the stuff we looked at yesterday, the job of modern taxonomy, dividing things into domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, figuring out those relationships, is the job of looking at the evolutionary history of the animal. When things belong to the same domain, we're saying that they were common ancestors for a long time, and only recently did they change to be two different things. Versus things that are in different kingdoms, they haven't had a common ancestor for a long time. They are very distantly related. We are very closely related to apes. We are kind of closely related to birds. We're very distantly related to bacteria. We're related to everything. Our best understanding is that everything comes from one original kind of cell or one original pool of cells. So we are distant relatives of everything on Earth, but more closely related with things that branched off more recently. Does that make some kind of sense? I hope. You'd tell me if it didn't. You'd put your hand up and say, hey, Orlando, you don't make any sense. Get somebody good in here. And I'd go across to the hall of the grade 9 class and be like, can anyone here explain biology? And somebody would come in and do it. Let me know if I need to do that. Okay, so how do we figure any of this stuff out? Well, I'm going to rehash what we said yesterday. I want to kind of rehash because the first thing we look at is anatomy. What am I looking at here? I love this example. What is this? That is a human arm. All right, and we've got the big bone of the arm, which is called the humerus. Very good. We've got these two bones that are the creepy bones in your arm, because if you hold your hand in a, let me get this right, in a pronated position, they go parallel to each other, all right? And then, oh, it creeps me out just thinking about it, supinate your hand, and now they cross over one another. They make an X, and you can feel it. They rotate against each other and cross each other, right? Isn't that creepy? A little weird? And now they're crossed like this. And then when you pronate your hand again, now they run parallel to each other again. Ah! Those are called, does anyone know what these two bones are called? Radius and ulna. Very good. So good. And then we've got the bone carpus, the carpal bones. These are wrist bones. Hamate, lunate, pisiform, trapezius. Damn it, I can't do it. At some point I could do that. And then we've got the phalanges. We've got the metacarpal the phalanges and the metacarpals, proximal, medial, and distal. So in us, that makes sense. We've got a big bone here that lets us move our whole arm, right? We've got a second one that lets us move just a smaller part of our arm. Between the two of those, we have a big range of motion. Those, we have two bones instead of one here because our shoulder can't rotate. Our shoulder can go like this and like that, but we can't twist our whole arm this way. but we can twist it at the elbow because there's 2 bones here, right? So we have radius and ulna here to allow them rotation, and we've got about 190, 200 degrees of rotation possible there. That's pretty good. And then we've got bones here to give us a pretty wide range of motion there. So these bones make sense for us. Now, what is this? You're actually close, not a dog. You're really close. Look at those.
Cat?
Yeah, very good. This is a house cat.
Really?
Yeah. And it's a forelimb, which means a front leg. Now look at the bones there, and you'll see they have a different shape, and yet, essentially they have the exact same bones. The exact same bones. They are, and I always think of this as, you know in a video game, how you've got like your base character, and then you can just like stretch things and bigger, smaller, wider, and that's how you kind of design your character? If you look at the skeletons of these 2 things, the cat, despite the fact that its front legs are used for an entirely different thing than our arms, right? Our arms are used for picking things up, moving them, and manipulating them, whereas cats walk on them. An entirely different thing that does a really different job, and yet look, the same bones, just slightly different shapes, yeah.
They all kind of have the same, the curve.
Yeah, a wrist, right? That's your wrist. And so you see the cat, it uses its wrist to be able to manipulate its paw like that. Okay. Now you say, well, a human arm and a house cat's forelimb, those are reasonably similar. What do we have here?
A lot of weird-looking phalanges.
We do have some weird-looking phalanges. You can go up to somebody and say, you got some weird-looking phalanges on you, buddy. I don't know. It's a blue whale flipper.
Fight the blue whale?
Well, seeing as its heart weighs 3 times what you weigh, I wouldn't mend it. But, you know, you do what you like. And then, what do we have here?
Bird's wing?
Not a bird's wing.
Eagle's wing?
It is a bat wing. Wing is actually a very different structure, and it doesn't look much like our arms. But if you look, a bat has a wrist inside of its wing. What is that wrist doing? What is the wrist doing inside of a whale's flipper?
So it can do that.
Kind of, but mostly it does nothing. Mostly it's there, not because it's needed, but because this was made by slowly changing from something that looked more like this. The whale is a really interesting thing, where we are sure that whales aren't things that always lived in the water, but the evidence seems to show us that whales were things that had already evolved to live up on land, and then evolved back into living part-time in water, and then eventually evolved to living more time in water, and eventually evolved back to living in water when they used to live in land, which is why they have these structures that don't make any sense for a sea creature. I promise you, there's no wrist inside a fish's fins or a shark's fins, because it doesn't make sense to have a wrist in there. It's not being used. But it's in there because a whale didn't come to be by somebody sitting down and saying, let's sketch something that would be the perfect and most efficient thing to float through the water. It came to be by something slowly changing over time, changing its habits, changing a little bit, and over 1 million years, generation after generation after generation, tens of millions of generations, changing and changing. And you end up with features that don't really make sense. But they make sense if you understand the history of where they come from. It is not using the wrist in its wing the way we use our wrist, but it's there. It's there because that's how it came to be. Yeah?
Are bat ones also follow like the...
No. Again, because a bat doesn't evolve from birds. A bat is an evolution of us. So the way they solve that problem is by having, relative to their body, really big wings with not feathers that let some air through, but just this really flat surface that is, yeah, so they handle the problem differently, just more surface area, because their bones are heavier than a bird's bones. A bat really is basically a rat whose front legs have become wings. Okay, so what we can say here is then, the incredibly similar bone structure tells us these animals are closely related. In other words, we have a recent common ancestor. In other words, one of our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents developed wrist bones, and that happened before humans, cats, whales, and bats separated off in the family tree. So somewhere in the past, wrist bones developed, and that happened before whatever animal split off to become more cat-like, more human-like, more whale-like, more bat-like. And that's not that recent, because that happened millions of years ago. But we know that that happened before the branching off. If you see a trait that a bunch of things all have, that trait had to have developed before they branched off to be separate species. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Flying fish work.
No idea. I don't know anything about flying fish, but I bet they're cool. The only thing I know about flying fish is in the game Super Mario Brothers, and I know they make those levels more challenging.
Oh yeah, 2-3 and 7-3.
That's what I'm talking about. Okay, so we can look at all kinds of different many traits to get a full picture of when species differentiated from one another. And that word differentiate means like branched off. Okay, I'm gonna make it. Okay, we can also look at things that aren't visible, things that we would have to go into a lab and study. So if this is evidence from anatomy, the shape of things, you can do a dissection and see anatomy. You can look at bones, look at muscles, look at shapes, get all that stuff. We can go a level deeper and we can look at physiology. We're comparing, in this case, what chemicals the bodies produce. What types of cells they have. Things of that nature, and we can compare them. Because we can see, for example, something like insulin being used to control blood sugar. That's something that we have in common with a lot of animals. And so we can look and say, okay, the development of insulin had to happen before we branched off from all those other animals. Whereas insects don't produce insulin. Bacteria don't produce insulin, right? So that's something, bacteria obviously don't have blood. So that's something that we produce that they don't. Now, you couldn't look you couldn't dissect an animal and see if it has insulin. You'd have to test for it in a lab. Does that make sense? So doing this requires lab techniques, technology, and expertise. And this can be useful because sometimes physiology gives us information that anatomy wouldn't. You would expect, based on anatomy, expect is not spelled with a D. I'm sorry, I get excited. You would expect, just looking at these creatures, 2 crabs and a spider, just looking at them, which 2 would you expect to be most related? There's not really one answer here, but maybe the 2 crabs would make sense, right? Most closely related. That makes sense because they're both crabs, they both have shells, they both live in the water, so that'd be reasonable. If you didn't think that, what might you think? Because why? And yet, believe it or not, in reality, these 2 are actually the most closely related. That's a surprising result. And we know this because of the enzymes their body produces. Which is an example of physiology. So we're not going to get, there's a million examples, but I just want to show you that this is a better technique, and it's a better technique because sometimes things look similar, but actually evolved in what we call parallel. They evolved away from each other, not related to each other, and they just happen to have ended up evolving kind of the same way. You can imagine maybe there's a family out there that lives in an entirely different country but is really like yours, just by random chance. They like playing the same board games and fight about the same things at the dinner table. Sometimes things look the same, but not because they're related, but just because they happen to end up looking the same.